All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our talk on gun regulation. The specific question tonight is consensus on gun regulation possible? With me tonight, I have Jon Lott, I think a very prominent commentator on this topic, and also Jon Stokes, who is also a prominent voice on this topic. So tonight, we want to endeavor to talk about this topic in a way that identifies room for consensus, leave the typical pitted against each other argumentation level, and just see where this leaves us. So I guess the first question, and let's just have an open conversation from there, is, to you, Jon Lott, what is the room for compromise, for consensus, to maybe reach out to the other side on this debate, to find some common ground and make this less of a divisive, almost culture war-like debate?
Right. Well, thanks, Alex. Appreciate you having me on, or both of us on. Look, the number one gun control issue for years seems to have been background checks on private transfers of guns. And, you know, everybody wants to try to keep bad people from being able to get guns. The question is, what's the best way to do it? I personally don't think that background checks are particularly effective at reducing any type of crime. But if other people believe it, they really think that it works, there are a couple things that they could do that would make it very easy for them to pass them. I've been making these points for literally a couple decades. One of the things is that virtually everybody who gets stopped is what we call a false positive. We hear that there are 3 million dangerous, prohibited people that have been stopped from getting guns because of background checks. But that's simply not right. What they should say is that there have been 3 million denials, and that virtually all of those were mistakes. It's one thing to stop a felon from getting a gun. It's another one to stop somebody simply because they have a name similar to a felon from getting a gun. And, there's an easy way to fix this, and that is basically require that the federal government has to do the background checks in the same way that the federal government mandates that private companies checks. If private companies had an error rate that was 1,000th the error rate that the federal government has, those companies under federal law would be sued out of existence. The gun control advocates, I've been bringing this up for 18 years. They refuse to even talk about it. There have been senators and others in the current Fix NICS bill to go and try to get that taken care of now, but Democrats will refuse to put that into the Fix NICS bill. I personally don't understand, because they say, well, we need a broad net to be able to go and catch everybody. But that really doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you go to a Democrat who's knowledgeable and you were just to talk to them about why they have the background checks for employers set up the way they did, they would say you gotta put in all the information, the exact name, other things into the process for checking, because if you don't, you're going to get a lot of false positives. Well, the same thing applies to guns. Primarily, the people who get hurt are minorities. People tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks have names similar to other blacks.
So is it fair to say that this is a technical issue, that if it was solved on the federal level with a better technical implementation, that background checks could be more effective? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that rather than saying you had 3 million people stopped, what would happen is you'd be saying you have thousands of people stopped over the decades. But I don't think Democrats want to do that, because it would make the number seem much smaller. They like a number that says 3 million.
Got it.
And even though that means that it's basically poor people, particularly minorities, who are overwhelmingly being stopped from having guns for protection.
So Jon, if we pass this over to you, back to this was, I think, a very specific point. Where do you see room for consensus where either side could be reaching out to each other and start, working together versus just, screaming at each other and having this be a shouting match?
So I have a few different thoughts on that, but first I would like to speak to this background check thing. You know, Jon raises a good point, and I actually read a good article on gun control from a socialist website the other day, and they were talking about the regressivity of these background checks and how this is exactly right, that it hits minorities harder. I actually had this experience in a gun store in Austin. I went in to pick up a gun for an FFL transfer. There was a gentleman next to me, and his background check didn't go through. He was turned down, and so the guy told him, "Well, you'll have to come back, you know, in a week or so." So when the guy left, you know, I thought, oh, he must be a criminal or something. So I asked the gun clerk. I said, "What's the deal? Why was this guy turned down?" It's like, "Well, this gentleman, he's Hispanic, and he has a really common Hispanic name, like Jesus Hernandez, I think was, or some kind of variant. It was like Mike Smith equivalent kind of name." And this got flagged on the background check list. And so he's going to have to wait like another week or so for this to get cleared up before he can come back in and get his firearm. So, you know, this is apparently, and the guy didn't seem that perturbed. I mean, I think this is probably happens to him every single time. And this,
well, hopefully it gets cleared up in a week. A lot of these guys are forced to have to spend thousands of dollars to appeal if they're going to get it fixed at all. And most of them just give up because they can't afford to hire a lawyer to go and do it. I've seen costs that can be $15,000 or so to go through the process to get it fixed.
Yeah,
that's a very specific topic. What other areas do you think
I'm going to segue. So my segue is, you know, I think that for one, doing this background check, like every time there's a purchase, I don't understand it. Like I got my Texas license to carry. I was thoroughly vetted. I think I submitted some prints, so on and so forth. It's kind of like the TSA pre-check. There's a pretty serious process, and I have a card in my wallet. And so now when I go into a Texas gun store, I'm vetted, and I show them the CHL, and they're like, "Okay, you can walk out with a firearm," which is fine. So for me, and I did also, I have an NFA item, and it's the National Firearms Act item, and so I submitted prints and all this kind of thing. And I think, like, okay, well, if I want to buy another suppressor, why do I have to do that again? Why do I have to do it for why do I have to do this fingerprints and passport photo and the whole thing every time? Why isn't there some kind of like a card, you know, more like a national light? I actually am kind of a proponent of a federal, at least a semi-auto licensing regime that's something on the model of the state CHL. I understand the objections to that are federal involvement and overriding of local gun laws. But to me, this kind of, even if it's not a federal type of license, the kind of idea that we're going to focus on the who, and we're going to quit with this toying around with the what, vertical foregrips, and, you know, is the magazine, is 15 rounds okay, or do we do 7 rounds, or whatever arbitrary number that some lawyer made up. This is crazy. So, and we also, we're kind of in a cultural moment where we're all, and I mean, I don't want to go in the wrong direction with this, but we all kind of understand that we're getting better at identifying people. There's sort of a shift in, okay, in the idea of vetting. You know, we have TSA pre-check. We have the CHL programs. I mean, we know how to vet individuals, and so why don't we try that? That seems less terrible. And I think in my conversations with gun owners is that something like maybe an updated background check system where there's I've seen multiple people propose an app on your phone that you can download, and anybody can do a background check. And there are ways to handle that where anonymity and privacy are secured. But say I wanted to sell you a firearm here in Texas, and we could both use this background check app. And so there are ways to do that. Maybe just regular reauthorization, a regular background check, like once every few years, or to maintain a license, something along those lines. But I think Jon is right in the sense that there's a lot of legacy kind of equipment here. There's legacy in the sense of there's an apparatus, and people are dependent on, okay, well, we can brag about 3 million numbers. Or there's a kind of, after every crisis, both sides kind of move in. And so the Everytown and the Bloomberg people, they have their roster of things that they want to push. And that roster hasn't changed very much in the past 20 years. I mean, it really hasn't. You would think
on that roster, because I mean, you two would probably agree that after Parkland, this conversation has changed in a way. There is more of a dynamic, especially when it comes to support of the liberal side of the debate, right? Just taking that as a reality, what could be done in terms of outreach to, make hardcore gun control art advocates happy?
That's what I was trying to do. That's what I was trying to do.
I understand that.
Number one thing. It wouldn't have stopped one of the mass public shootings this century or even years before. They keep on pushing. I mean, the number one thing, the one thing that Obama brought up every single time were these background checks and private transfers. And my point was simply 2 reasonable small changes would make it easy for them to get it passed. But they refuse to make the little changes. My deal is, look, I don't think it would help, but I can figure out ways to get over the objections. I'm not a rights person. I don't make rights arguments. To me, the bottom line is whether it's going to make a difference in terms of crime. And I don't know why, other than the fact that their goal really isn't to reduce crime. Their goal, I fortunately come to believe, is to reduce gun ownership. I'll give you one fast, simple example. In 2013, when Colorado was passing its background checks and private transfers, I got a call from some state legislators asking me what amendment I would put up. And my suggestion was there was a state tax on each transfer of a gun. My suggestion was to exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay a state tax every time they transferred a gun. With the exception of 2 pro-gun Democrats, every other Democrat in the state legislature voted against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay the state tax. How many taxes can you think of where Democrats will fight tooth and nail against exempting people below the poverty level from paying a tax?
I think there's so much of this culture war aspect now. I mean, I've talked to people who are active in this debate on both sides for the past couple of months since Parkland, and the feeling on both sides is I don't want to give the other side anything. Like, why would I compromise with them? The pro-gun side thinks, well, we've compromised for the past 30 years. We've given up right after right after right. And the anti-gun side says we've compromised for the past 30 years and still, this and that. And so, I've had both sides tell me a mirror image of the same thing, which is I don't want to give them an inch. So for instance, the semi-auto licensing thing, both sides like it, or not universally. I don't speak for either side universally, but I have gotten very positive reception from both sides. But when it comes down to it, they'll say, yeah, but I'm never going to propose this. We're never going to propose this because it would look like we're giving something up. So you might say, why don't we trade universal background checks for removing suppressors from the NFA regime or from some of the stuff in the Share Act and the Share Omnibus? And in theory, both sides would think maybe that's a win, but neither side wants to say, I'm going to give something to the other side because, why would I do that?
I think exactly the crux in this whole problem. And by the way, John, for some reason, your timer is not counting down. So you will be.
I'm winning.
You can very generously donate to both John and I, please.
Sounds like the infinite amount to donate.
Yeah. But I think that's exactly the crux of the matter from my perspective. And just for some background, I grew up in Germany. We have very strict gun laws there. In my opinion, the gun laws that we have make sense. Both my parents are hunters. There were always guns in my house, but it was very strict. So coming to the US and seeing what the situation is here, really the question is, how are you able to separate the whole cultural aspect where either side says, I'm not going to budge an inch from the reasonable conversation, as you said, where people could probably say, changes in background checks, certain other changes might make sense. What do you think? What could actually be done to separate that?
Look, I'm actually very pessimistic right now, and I'll tell you why. Because if you look at school shootings, the recent Northwestern study, they're down from their peak in the 90s. The number of them. Schools are safer than they've ever been. There's some, I think 50 million kids, they go to school here in the U.S., school-age kids, and over 100,000 public schools. And in any given year, in terms of an actual mass shooting out of school, now not one of these things where somebody fired a BB gun at a bus window and it got put in this database of school shootings, which this is happening. But when you see some of these numbers, they're crazy. But actual school shootings, you have in the single digits of kids every year. And not to say that's acceptable. I mean, I have 3 kids in school. If one of them were in those single digits, or 3 of them, God forbid, that would be devastating. But the point is that the odds, my kids are far less safe on the drive to school than they are at school, okay? So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing, crime has gone down since its peak in the 90s across the developed world. I think that, and John probably knows the numbers better than I do, the number of firearm fatalities in the U.S. has dropped, I think in absolute terms, from say 94, I think maybe was the peak by is it 91. 91. Okay, is it over 50%? What's the number?
But guys,
while the population has increased, so I think that a lot of this is driven by a lot of this as a conflict is driven by social media and panic and outrage and the cultural war dynamic that's going on right now. And
John, you're addressing the problem, right? It's someone who, and you need to be a bit more generous with your time here. someone who is, let's say, someone from every town. They are not going to, regardless of what statistics you present, whether they are accurate or not. These statistics, I'm not the judge on that. Statistics won't solve this debate. And John, sorry to say this, but I think you know this best of all, that arguments based on statistics are not going to solve this. So what arguments are? What is?
Which John are you talking to? The other John?
Yeah, either of you. Really, this is.
I'm out of time, so I don't know what I'm supposed to do at this point.
I'm trying to distribute the time here.
Either of you, I mean, you just said what the problem is, Jon Stokes.
Okay, so I'll jump back in and I'll say that I think that the solution for this as a crisis is for people to get off of Facebook and realize that their kids are not about to be gunned down in school. They're not about to be gunned down in the supermarket. This is sort of still diminishing. Actually, it's upticked recently. But, per capita, the gun violence rate is very low. And it's very isolated to a few zip codes, so that.
Listen, do you think that's a realistic thing? Do you think that's realistic?
That's why I said I'm a pessimist. That's why I said I'm a pessimist. And as many times as people try to put out proposals, I just linked another one on Twitter, a really reasonable, thoughtful compromise proposal. This is going to get no traction because the gun issue is a pawn in a larger culture war that's going on right now.
Proposal.
It's one of these give and take things. It's take some things out of the NFA, suppressors, short barrel rifles, universal background checks with an app, and really thorough vetting. There's a few other things. There's a few things on each side, and it's you give up some things, we give up some things, everybody's happy. But nobody wants to give up any things because they want to fight a culture war.
Fight a culture war.
Online with each other. I don't think they want to fight a hot culture war, but I think they want to go on and meme it out and stuff like this. I would hope that reasonable compromise proposals where each side gives something up could find traction because everybody's really sick of this.
And do you think that has to happen first on a federal level, or do you think the chances of this happening on a state level are higher?
I don't know.
John Lott.
No.
Look, unfortunately, I've come to believe that you have two different views of the world that I don't think can match. I mean, the types of compromises that I was offering before would be something, say, you want background checks on universal transfers? I can get you that if you make two changes. Two changes. I don't even know how anybody can argue against. Why should blacks and Hispanics be disproportionately stopped? Who can justify a system that does something like that? But I've come to believe that their goal is to really get rid of all guns. And when you have that type of opposite view on what you want to have done, it makes it hard to compromise. You know, if you can explain to me what is the objection to going and making so you don't have all these false positives, that millions of people, primarily blacks and Hispanics, are being stopped and being forced to spend thousands of dollars to go and get the system fixed, isn't obvious to me. But the other thing that I would suggest is that, look, it costs $125 to do a background check in DC for you to transfer a gun. If you believe it reduces crime, and I don't, but if you believe it does, then you believe it reduces crime for everybody, not just the individual who's buying the gun. Well, if everybody benefits, have everybody pay for it. That's what an economist would do. That's what I learned when I went through graduate school in economics. And yet, if you bring that up to gun control advocates, it's like somebody holding a cross to a vampire. It's completely non-starter. And when you see things like that, or like I can give you 20 case that I gave you before, it indicates to me that their main goal is to ban guns. And when you have that type of end difference there, it makes it very hard. If you can explain to me why they oppose the two simple things, because I can get it passed tomorrow. If they made that agreement to get rid of these false positives and to pay for it out of general revenue, there'd be like no objections. They'd get it passed tomorrow, but they won't do it. Why won't they do it?
I don't know the answer to that. I think.
Well, I'll tell you why. The answer is because they don't want it to work. I mean, the types of things John's bringing up reasonable solutions to the stuff. If you can explain to me why they don't want to pay for this out of general revenue, said that all background checks had to be out of general revenue, I guarantee you they would fight against that. I've seen them fight against it tooth and nail. It's a complete non-starter. And the reason is because they can't ban guns, but they can make it costly. And who do you think you're stopping from getting a gun when a background check costs $125? It's not wealthy, well-to-do people you're stopping poor people. When it costs $450 to go through the process to get a concealed carry permit, who do you think you're stopping? After the Heller decision in Washington, D.C., it cost over $800 to get a license and register your handgun in the city, in the District of Columbia. Who do they think they're allowing to go and get it? It's basically just wealthy people, not poor people, not the people who need the guns the most. And I think if you have another explanation for why they keep pushing for these particular rules that disarm people, these aren't rules that stop bad people. These are rules that stop good, law-abiding minorities and middle income and poor people from getting guns.
You know, John, what I hear, and by the way, I hear that on both sides, I hear they. And it sounds a little pathetic, but I think this conversation needs to start with what can we do?
Well, I'm offering suggestions. I'm saying if your goal is to get these background checks in, it's the number one thing they bring up after each shooting, even though it is.
Right. Sorry, John, but we're out of time. So thank you so much, the two of you, for this conversation. We'll be having more of these conversations, and we challenge all the viewers to participate in these conversations and, you know, hopefully get to a point where some of this compromise, some of this consensus can happen. Because on the road that this conversation is on, as you said, John, hopefully, you know, who knows, but it's a cold culture war. God forbid it ever became more than that. So thank you very much, and good night.